Part 3 of Naudsonce by H. Beam Piper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. One of the huts had been fitted as contact team headquarters, with all the view and communication screens installed, and one end partitioned off and soundproofed for Lillian to study recordings in. It was cocktail time when they returned. Conversationally, it was a continuation from lunch. Karl Dorver was even more convinced than ever of his telepathic hypothesis, and he had completely converted Anna de Jong to it. "Look at that." He pointed at the snooper screen, which gave a view of the plaza from directly above. "They're reaching an agreement already." So they seemed to be, though upon what was less apparent. The horn had stopped and the noise was diminishing. The odd thing was that peace was being restored, or was restoring itself, as the uproar had begun, outwardly from the center of the plaza to the periphery of the crowd. The same thing had happened when Goffredo had ordered the submachine gun fired, and now that he recalled when he had dealt with the line crasher. "Suppose a few of them in the middle are agreed," Anna said. "They are all thinking in unison, combining their telepathic powers. They dominate those nearest to them, who join and amplify their telepathic signal, and it spreads out through the whole group. A mental chain reaction." "That would explain the mechanism of community leadership, and I'd been wondering about that," Dorver said, becoming more excited. "It's a mental aristocracy, an especially gifted group of telepaths, in agreement and using their powers in concert, implanting their opinions in the minds of all the others. I'll bet the purpose of the horn is to distract the thoughts of the others so that they can be more easily dominated. And the noise of the shots shocked them out of communication with each other. No wonder they were frightened." Bennett Fayon was far from convinced. "So far, this telepathy theory is only an assumption. I find it a lot easier to assume some fundamental difference between the way they translate sound into sense data and the way we do. We think those combs on top of their heads are their external hearing organs, but we have no idea what's back of them, or what kind of neural hookup is connected to them. I wish I knew how these people disposed of their dead. I need a couple of fresh cadavers. Too bad they aren't warlike. Nothing like a good bloody battle to advance the science of anatomy. And what we don't know about savant anatomy is practically the entire subject." "I should imagine the animals hear in the same way," Millard said. "When the wagon wheels and the hoes and the blacksmith tools come down from the ship, we'll trade for cattle. When they make the second landing in the mountains, I'm going to do a lot of hunting," Loughran added. "I'll get wild animals for you." "Well, I'm going to assume that the vocal noises they make are meaningful speech," Lillian Ransby said. "So far, I've just been trying to analyze them for phonetic values. Now I'm going to analyze them for sound wave patterns. No matter what goes on inside their private nervous systems, the sounds exist as waves in the public atmosphere. I'm going to assume that the Lord Mayor and his stooges were all trying to say the same thing when they were pointing to themselves, and I'm going to see if all four of those sounds have any common characteristic." By the time dinner was over, they were all talking in circles, none of them hopefully. They all made recordings of the speech about the slithy toves in the Malamute saloon. Lillian wanted to find out what was different about them. Louis Goffredo saw to it that the camp itself would be visible lighted, and beyond the lights he set up more photoelectric robot sentries and put a couple of snoopers to circling on contragravity with infrared lights and receptors. He also insisted that all his own men and all Dave Questel's Navy construction engineers keep their weapons ready to hand. The natives in the village were equally distrustful. They didn't herd the cattle up from the meadows where they had been pastured, but they lighted watchfires along the edge of the mound as soon as it became dark. It was 3 hours after nightfall when something on the indicator board for the robot sentries went off like a startled rattlesnake. Everybody, talking idly or concentrating on writing up the day's observations, stiffened. Louis Gofredo, dozing in his chair, was on his feet instantly and crossing the hut to the instruments. His second-in-command, who had been playing chess with Willi Schallenmacher, rose and snatched his belt from the back of his chair, putting it on. "Take it easy," Gofredo said. "Probably just a cow or a horse, local equivalent, that strayed over from the other side." He sat down in front of one of the snooper screens and twisted knobs on the remote controls. The monochrome view, transformed from infrared, rotated as the snooper circled and changed course. The other screen showed the camp receding and the area around it widening as its snooper gained altitude. "It's not a big party," Gofredo was saying. "I can't see... Oh, yes, I can. Only 2 of them." The humanoid figures, one larger than the other, were moving cautiously across the fields, crouching low. The snooper went down toward them, and then he recognized them. The man and woman whom the blue-robed villager had tried to shove out of the queue that afternoon. Gofredo recognized them, too. "Your friends, Mark." "Harry," he told his subordinate, "go out and pass the word around. Only 2, and we think they're friendly. Keep everybody out of sight. We don't want to scare them away." The snooper followed closely behind them. The man was no longer wearing his apron. The woman's tunic was even more tattered and soiled. She was leading him by the hand. Now and then she would stop and turn her head to the rear. The snooper over the mound showed nothing but half a dozen fire watchers dozing by their fires. Then the pair were at the edge of the camp lights. As they advanced, they seemed to realize that they had passed a point of no return. They straightened and came forward steadily, the woman seeming to be guiding her companion. "What's happening, Mark?" It was Lillian. She must have just come out of the soundproofed speech lab. "You know them, the pair in the queue this afternoon. I think we've annexed a couple of friendly natives." They all went outside. The 2 natives, having come into the camp, had stopped. For a moment the man in the breechclout seemed undecided whether he was more afraid to turn and run than advance. The woman, holding his hand, led him forward. They were both bruised, and both had minor cuts, and neither of them had any of the things that had been given to them that afternoon. "The rest of the gang beat them up and robbed them," Gofredo began angrily. "See what you did?" Darver began. "According to their own customs, they had no right to be ahead of those others, and now you've gotten them punished for it." "I'd have done more to that fellow than Mark did if I'd have been there when it happened." The Marine officer turned to Millard. "Look, this is your show, Paul. How you run it is your job. But in your place, I'd take that pair back to the village and have them point out who beat them up, and teach the whole gang of them a lesson. If we're going to colonize this planet, you're going to have to establish Federation law. And Federation law says you mustn't gang up on people and beat and rob them. We don't have to speak Svantese to make them understand what we'll put up with and what we won't. Later, Louis. After we've gotten a treaty with somebody." Millard broke off. "Watch this." The woman was making sign talk. She pointed to the village on the mound. Then with her hands she shaped a bucket like the ones that had been given to them, and she made a snatching gesture away from herself. She indicated the neckcloths and the sheath knife and the other things, and snatched them away too. She made beating motions and touched her bruises and the man's. All the time she was talking excitedly in a high, shrill voice. The man made the same grrr, grrr noises that he had that afternoon. "No, we can't take any punitive action. Not now," Millard said. "But we'll have to do something for them." Vengeance, it seemed, wasn't what they wanted. The woman made vehement gestures of rejection toward the village, then bowed, placing her hands on her brow. The man imitated her obeisance, then they both straightened. The woman pointed to herself and to the man, and around the circle of huts and landing craft. She began scuttling around, picking up imaginary litter and sweeping with an imaginary broom. The man started pounding with an imaginary hammer, then chopping with an imaginary axe. Lillian was clapping her hands softly. Good, got it the first time. You let us stay, we work for you. How about it, Paul? Millard nodded. Punitive actions unadvisable, but we will show our attitude by taking them in. You tell them, Louis. These people seem to like your voice. Goffredo put a hand on each of their shoulders. You stay with us. He pointed around the camp. You stay this place. Their faces broke into that funny, just-before-tears expression that meant happiness with them. The man confined his vocal expressions to his odd growling. The woman twittered joyfully. Goffredo put a hand on the woman's shoulder, pointed to the man, and from him back to her. He inquired. The woman put a hand on the man's head, then brought it down to within a foot of the ground. She picked up the imaginary infant and rocked it in her arms, then set it down and grew it up until she had her hand on the top of the man's head again. That was good, Mom, Goffredo told her. Now you and Sonny come along. We'll issue you equipment and find you billets. He added, What in blazes are we going to feed them? XT3? They gave them replacements for all the things that had been taken away from them. They gave the man a one-piece suit of marine combat coveralls. Lillian gave the woman a lavender bathrobe, and Anna contributed a red scarf. They found them quarters at one end of a store shed, after making sure that there was nothing they could get at that would hurt them or that they could damage. They gave each of them a pair of blankets and a pneumatic mattress, which delighted them, although the cots puzzled them at first. What do you think about feeding them, Bennett? Millard asked, when the two Svants had gone to bed and they were back in the headquarters hut. You said the food on this planet is safe for Terrans. So I did, and it is, but the rule's not reversible. Things we eat might kill them, Theon said. Meats will be especially dangerous, and no caffeine and no alcohol. Alcohol won't hurt them, Schellenmacher said. I saw big jars full of fermenting fruit mash back of some of those houses. In about a year it ought to be fairly good wine. C2H5OH is the same on any planet. Well, we'll get native foodstuffs tomorrow, Millard said. We'll have to do that by signs, too, he regretted. Get Mom to help you. She's pretty sharp, Lillian advised. But I think Sonny's the village half-wit. Anna de Jong agreed. Even if we don't understand Svant psychology, that's evident. He's definitely subnormal. The way he clings to his mother for guidance is absolutely pathetic. He's a mature adult, but mentally he's still a little child. That may explain it, Dorver cried. A mental defective in a community of telepaths, constantly invading the minds of others with irrational and disgusting thoughts. No wonder he is rejected and persecuted. And in a community on this culture level, the mother of an abnormal child is often regarded with superstitious detestation. Yes, of course, Anna de Jong instantly agreed, and began to go into the villagers' hostility to both mother and son. Both of them were now taking the telepathy hypothesis for granted. Well, maybe so. He turned to Lillian. What did you find out? Well, there is a common characteristic in all four sounds. A little patch on the screen at 1720 cycles. The odd thing is that when I try to repeat the sound, it isn't there. Odd indeed. If a Svant said something, he made sound waves. If she imitated the sound, she ought to imitate the wave pattern. He said so, and she agreed. But come back here and look at this, she invited. She had been using a visibilizing analyzer. In it, a sound was broken by a set of filters into frequency groups, translated into light from dull red to violet, paling into pure white. It photographed the light pattern on high-speed film, automatically developed it, and then made a print copy and projected the film in slow motion on a screen. When she pressed a button, a recorded voice said, "Fwonk." An instant later, a pattern of vertical lines in various colors and lengths was projected on the screen. "Those green lines," she said. "That's it. Now, watch this." She pressed another button, got the photo print out of a slot, and propped it beside the screen. Then she picked up a hand phone and said "Fwonk" into it. It sounded like the first one, but the pattern that danced onto the screen was quite different. Where the green had been, there was a patch of pale blue lines. She ran the other three savants' voices, each saying, presumably, "me." Some of them were mainly up in the blue, others had a good deal of yellow and orange, but they all had the little patch of green lines. "Well, that seems to be the information," he said. "The rest is just noise." "Maybe one of them is saying, 'John Doe, me, son of John Blow,' and another is saying, 'Tough guy, me, lick anybody in town.' All in one syllable." Then he shrugged. How did he know what these people could pack into one syllable? He picked up the hand phone and said "Fwonk" into it. The pattern, a little deeper in color and with longer lines, was recognizably like hers and unlike any of the savants. The others came in singly and in pairs and threes. They watched the colors dance on the screen to picture the four savant words which might or might not all mean me. They tried to duplicate them. Louis Goffredo and Willy Schellenmacher came closest of anybody. Bennett Phaon was still insisting that the savants had a perfectly comprehensible language to other savants. Anna de Jong had started to veer a little away from the Dorver hypothesis. There was a difference between the event-level sound, which was a series of waves of alternately crowded and rarefied molecules of air, and object-level sound, which was an auditory sensation inside the nervous system, she admitted. That, Phaon crowed, was what he'd been saying all along. Their auditory system was probably such that fwonk and poink and tweet and croosh all sounded alike to them. By this time, fwonk and poink and tweet and croosh had all become swear words among the joint Space Navy Colonial Office contact team. "Well, if I hear the two sounds alike, why doesn't the analyzer hear them alike?" Karl Dorver demanded. "It has better ears than you do, Karl." "Look at how many different frequencies there are in that word, all crowded up behind each other," Lillian said. "But it isn't sensitive or selective enough. I'm going to see what Alicia Keithley can do about building me a better one." Ayesha was signals and detection officer of the Hubert Penrose. Dave Questell mentioned that she'd had a hard day and was probably making sack time, and she wouldn't welcome being called at 0130. Nobody seemed to have realized that it had gotten that late. "Well, I'll call the ship and have a recording made for her when she gets up. But till we get something that'll sort this mess out and make sense of it, I'm stopped." "You're stopped, period, Lillian," Dorver told her. "What these people gibber at us doesn't even make as much sense as the shooting of Dan McJabberwocky. The real information is conveyed by telepathy." Lieutenant J.G. Ayesha Keithley was on the screen the next morning while they were eating breakfast. She was a blonde, like Lillian. "I got your message. You seem to have problems, don't you?" "Speaking conservatively, yes. You see what we're up against?" "You don't know what their vocal organs are like, do you?" the girl in Navy uniform in the screen asked. Lillian shook her head. "Bennett Phaon's hoping for a war, or an epidemic, or something to break out so that he can get a few cadavers to dissect. Well, he'll find that they're pretty complex, Ayesha Keithley said. I identified stick and slip sounds, and percussion sounds, and pluck string sounds, along with the ordinary hiss and buzz speech sounds. Making a vocoder to reproduce that speech is going to be fun. Just what are you using in the way of equipment? Lillian was still talking about that when the two landing craft from the ship were sighted coming down. Charles Loughran and Willy Schallenmacher, who were returning to the Hubert Penrose to join the other landing party, began assembling their luggage. The others went outside, Howell among them. Mom and Sonny were watching the two craft grow larger and closer above, keeping close to a group of spacemen. Sonny was looking around excitedly, while Mom clung to his arm like a hen with an oversized chick. The reasoning was clear. These people knew all about big things that came down out of the sky and weren't afraid of them. Stick close to them and it would be perfectly safe. Sonny saw the contact team emerging from their hut and grabbed his mother's arm, pointing. They both beamed happily. That expression didn't look sad at all, now that you knew what it meant. Sonny began grug, grug, hideously. Mom hushed him with a hand over his mouth, and they both made eating gestures, rubbed their abdomens comfortably, and pointed toward the mess hut. Bennett Phaon was frightened. He turned and started on the double toward the cook, who was standing in the doorway of the hut, calling out to him. The cook spoke inaudibly. Phaon stopped short. "Unholy Saint Beelzebub, no!" he cried. The cook said something in reply, shrugging. Phaon came back, talking to himself. "Terran carniculture pork," he said when he returned. "Zarathustra pool ball fruit, potato flour hotcakes, and Baldur honey, and Odin flameberry jam. And 2 big cups of coffee apiece. It's a miracle they aren't dead now. If they're alive for lunch, we won't need to worry about feeding them anything we eat. But I'm glad somebody else has the moral responsibility for this." Lillian Ransby came out of the headquarters hut. "Ayesha's coming down this afternoon with a lot of equipment," she said. "We're not exactly going to count air molecules in the sound waves, but we'll do everything short of that. We'll need more lab space, soundproofed." "Tell Dave Questel what you want," Millard said. "Do you really think you can get anything?" She shrugged. "If there's anything there to get. How long it'll take is another question." End of Part 3.